When Bryce Anderson and his friends knocked 14-year-old Esperanza Flores from her wheelchair in the Eagles Peak High School parking lot that October morning, they thought no one was watching, but they were wrong. High up on Thunder Ridge, a legendary black Mustang stallion named Tornado witnessed every cruel laugh, every vicious shove, every moment of humiliation they inflicted on the girl he had been silently protecting for months. What these bullies didn't know was that their cowardly attack would awaken something ancient and fierce in the Montana wilderness. Something that would hunt them down with 1,500 pounds of wild fury and remind their small town of Willow, Greek that justice sometimes comes thundering from the mountains. This is the story of how a wild horse became a guardian angel, how a girl in a wheelchair discovered her true strength, and how an entire community learned that when you hurt the innocent, you face consequences far beyond anything parents, teachers, or the law could ever deliver. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The October wind carried the scent of pine and early snow across the Montana Valley as Esperanza Flores rolled her wheelchair down the familiar gravel path toward Eagles Peak High School. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot where yellow school buses lined up like sleeping giants. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as she navigated around the potholes that maintenance had promised to fix since September. From her position on Thunder Ridge, nearly 2 miles above the school, a massive black stallion stood motionless among the pine trees. Tornado's ears were pricked forward, his dark eyes fixed on the small figure making her way across the asphalt below. For 3 months now, he had watched this routine. The girl with the wheels instead of legs, moving with quiet determination while others walked past without seeing her struggle over the uneven ground. "Morning, Esperanza," called out Mrs. Patricia Williams as she unlocked the main doors. The school nurse always arrived early, her coffee mug steaming in the cold air. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams. How's your grandson doing with his baseball?" "Oh, you remember that? He made varsity, can you believe it? 15 years old and already catching for the high school team." Esperanza smiled as she rolled toward the wheelchair ramp. She remembered everyone's stories, their children, their worries. It was easier to focus on other people's lives than think about her own daily challenges. The ramp was slick with morning dew, requiring extra effort to maintain control as she made her way up the incline. Behind her, the rumble of a diesel truck announced the arrival of the Anderson family's red pickup. Bryce Anderson climbed out of the passenger side, his Letterman jacket hanging loose over his broad shoulders. At 16, he commanded attention wherever he went, his sandy hair perfectly styled, his confident swagger drawing admiring glances. "And from underclassmen girls, you see that pathetic display," Bryce muttered to Tyler Reed, who had been riding in the truck bed despite the cold morning air. Tyler jumped down, brushing dust from his jeans. "What display?" The cripple trying to act normal. "Watch this." Up on Thunder Ridge, the stallion's head lifted sharply. Something in the air had changed. His nostrils flared, detecting the sharp scent of aggression, the chemical signature of predators preparing to strike. His muscles tensed as he watched the 2 larger figures approach the girl. Esperanza had almost reached the main doors when she heard footsteps behind her, heavy boots on concrete moving with purpose. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Bryce and Tyler approaching, their expressions cold and calculating. "Hey there, Wheels," Bryce called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Several students turned to look, sensing drama about to unfold. Esperanza kept moving toward the doors, her hands working the wheelchair rims with practiced efficiency. She had learned long ago that the best defense against bullies was to avoid engagement, to reach safe spaces where teachers could intervene. "I'm talking to you," Bryce said, his tone sharper now. He lengthened his stride, closing the distance. Between them, leave her alone, Bryce. Ruby Torres emerged from behind the school bus, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She was small for a sophomore, but her voice carried authority that made even upperclassmen pause. Nobody asked you. Torres, this doesn't concern you. It concerns me when you're being a jackass to my friend. Tyler laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the brick walls of the school building. Your friend? You mean your charity case? On Thunder Ridge, the stallion began moving down the mountainside. His hooves found purchase on the rocky terrain as he navigated between pine trees and granite outcroppings. Something primitive and protective drove him forward, an instinct older than human civilization. Esperanza reached for the door handle, but Bryce was faster. He stepped in front of her wheelchair, blocking her path with his body. Where are you going so fast? We just want to talk. I need to get to first period, Esperanza said quietly, her hands gripping the wheelchair rims. Mr. Kim gets upset when students are late. Mr. Kim can wait, Tyler said, moving to her left side. We want to know something. How come you get special treatment around here? Ramps, elevators, extra time on tests. Doesn't seem fair to the rest of us. Ruby stepped closer, her dark eyes flashing with anger. She doesn't get special treatment. You idiots, she gets equal access. There's a difference. Equal access, Bryce laughed. She gets driven to school every day by Mommy and Daddy. She gets to skip PE class. She gets her own special bathroom. Sounds like special treatment to me. She gets driven to school because the bus isn't wheelchair accessible, Ruby shot back. She has her own bathroom because regular bathrooms aren't designed for wheelchairs, and she doesn't skip PE, she adapts the activities. Adapts, Tyler repeated mockingly. That's just a fancy word for getting out of doing real work. Esperanza felt heat rising in her cheeks. She had heard these accusations before, whispered in hallways and muttered during lunch periods, the assumption that her accommodations were privileges rather than necessities. I work harder than most students here, she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. I have to plan every route through the building. I have to arrive early to avoid crowded hallways. I have to carry extra supplies because I can't reach half the storage areas. Boo-hoo, Bryce said, stepping even closer. Poor little Esperanza and her hard life. You know what I think? I think you milked this whole wheelchair thing for attention. The stallion was now halfway down the mountain, his powerful legs carrying him through the forest with surprising speed for such a large animal. Birds scattered from the trees as he passed, sensing the predatory intensity that drove him forward. Back off, Bryce, Ruby warned, moving protectively in front of Esperanza's wheelchair. You're way out of line here. Am I? Or am I just saying what everyone else is thinking? A small crowd had gathered now, students drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting their feet and avoiding eye contact. Others watched with the morbid fascination of those who enjoyed watching others suffer. Nobody's thinking that except you and your brain-dead sidekick, Ruby snapped. Tyler's face flushed red. Who are you calling brain-dead, you little... Hey! The sharp voice of Coach Bradley cut through the morning air. The athletics instructor jogged toward them from the faculty parking lot, his whistle bouncing against his chest. What's going on here? Nothing, Coach, Bryce said smoothly, his demeanor shifting instantly to respectful student mode. Just having a conversation with some classmates. Coach Bradley looked around the group, taking in the tension, the protective stance Ruby had taken in front of Esperanza, the uncomfortable expressions on the bystanders' faces. Conversation looks pretty heated from where I'm standing. Everyone needs to get inside. Bell rings in 5 minutes. Yes, sir, Bryce said, stepping back from Esperanza's wheelchair. But as he moved away, he leaned down close to her ear. This isn't over, Wheels. You and your little girlfriend need to learn some respect. The crowd began to disperse as Coach Bradley supervised the movement toward the building. Ruby stayed close to Esperanza as they made their way through the doors, both girls silent as they processed what had just happened. In her first period science class, Esperanza tried to focus on Mr. Kim's lecture about atmospheric pressure, but her mind kept drifting to the encounter in the parking lot. She had dealt with subtle discrimination before, the stares and whispered comments that followed her through hallways. But Bryce's aggression felt different, more personal and threatening. "Miss Flores," Mr. Kim called out, startling her from her thoughts. "Can you tell us what happens when a low-pressure system moves through mountainous terrain?" "The air rises. As it hits the mountains," she answered automatically. "As it rises, it cools and condenses, often forming clouds and precipitation on the windward side." "Excellent. And what do we call the phenomenon that occurs on the leeward side?" "Rain shadow effect. The air descends and warms, creating drier conditions." Mr. Kim nodded approvingly and continued his lecture. Esperanza allowed herself a small smile. Whatever challenges she faced socially, academically, she was more than capable of holding her own. Outside, tornado had reached the base of Thunder Ridge. The school was still over a mile away, but he could smell the scents carried on the wind: fear, anger, and something else. The metallic tang of cruelty that made his muscles quiver with barely contained energy. During lunch period, Esperanza sat with Ruby and a few other friends at their usual table near the windows. The cafeteria buzzed with conversation and the clatter of trays, but she noticed how students at nearby tables kept glancing in her direction. "They're all talking about this morning," Ruby said quietly, following her gaze. "Let them talk," Esperanza replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Bryce Anderson is such a tool," said Josh Turner, a quiet junior who occasionally joined their lunch group. "My little sister says he picks on sixth graders too. Guy's got serious problems." "His problems don't give him the right to take them out on other people," Ruby said fiercely. Across the cafeteria, Bryce sat with the football team, regaling them with an exaggerated version of the morning's events. His gestures grew more animated as he described Esperanza's supposed helplessness, earning laughs from his teammates. "Look at her over there," he said loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Acting all tragic and misunderstood. I bet she loves the attention." Several students looked uncomfortable with his commentary, but none spoke up to challenge him. The social hierarchy of high school was a powerful force, and few were willing to risk their own standing to defend someone they barely knew. As the lunch period ended, Esperanza made her way toward her locker, navigating the crowded hallways with practiced skill. She had just reached her combination lock when she felt a presence behind her. "We need to finish our conversation from this morning." Bryce's voice was low and menacing. Esperanza's hands stilled on the lock dial. Around them, students hurried to their next classes, too focused on their own concerns to notice the confrontation developing. "There's nothing to finish," she said without turning around. "I think there is. See, you and your friend embarrassed me in front of half the school. That doesn't sit well with me. Then maybe you shouldn't have been acting like a bully." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. She had never been confrontational, had always chosen the path of least resistance, but something about Bryce's entitled attitude sparked a rebellion in her that surprised them both. Bryce stepped closer, his presence looming over her wheelchair. "What did you just call me?" "You heard me." On Thunder Ridge, now empty of its guardian, the wind howled through the pine trees. Far below, in the halls of Eagles Peak High School, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The Black Stallion continued his descent toward the valley, driven by instincts he couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. The bell for fifth period rang, but neither Bryce nor Esperanza moved toward their classrooms. The hallway emptied around them, leaving them alone in a space that suddenly felt charged with tension and possibility. "You're going to regret those words," Bryce said softly, but as he spoke a distant sound drifted through the open windows, the thunder of hooves on stone, growing closer with each passing moment. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing through the valley like distant thunder. Esperanza's heart hammered in her chest as Bryce leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. The empty hallway stretched before them, fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything feel more threatening. "You think you're so smart with your clever comebacks," Bryce whispered, "but you're just a broken little girl who needs special help with everything. I'm not broken." The words came out stronger than Esperanza felt. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her wheelchair rims. "No? Then prove it. Get out of that chair and walk to your next class." The cruelty in his voice made her stomach clench. She had heard variations of this taunt before, but never delivered with such venom. Bryce straightened up, crossing his arms as if he had just delivered a devastating argument. "That's what I thought. You can't because you're defective." The hoofbeats stopped. Somewhere outside, Tornado had reached the edge of the school property. His massive head lifted, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of his protected one's distress. The stallion's eyes were wild, primal instincts overriding 3 million years of evolution that should have made him flee from human settlements. "Esperanza," Ruby's voice carried down the hallway. She had noticed her friend's absence from biology class and come looking for her. Bryce stepped back slightly, but his posture remained aggressive. "This isn't finished, Wheels. Not by a long shot." Ruby jogged toward them, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. "What's going on here? Why aren't you guys in class?" "Just having a friendly chat," Bryce said, his tone shifting to mock innocence. "Esperanza was just telling me how much she appreciates all the special treatment she gets around here." "I never said that," Esperanza protested. "Sure you did, right before you called me a bully." Bryce's smile was cold and calculating. "Seems like someone needs to learn some respect." Ruby positioned herself between them, her small frame dwarfed by Bryce's bulk, but her stance unwavering. "The only person who needs to learn respect is you, Anderson. Leave her alone." "Or what? You'll report me to the principal, tell on me like a little tattletale?" "If that's what it takes." Bryce laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Go ahead, see how far that gets you. My dad donates more money to this school than your parents make in a year. Who do you think they're going to believe?" The truth of his words hung in the air like poison. Robert Anderson owned the largest construction company in 3 counties. His name was on the gymnasium, the computer lab, and the new science wing. His influence extended far beyond financial contributions. "Money doesn't make you right," Ruby said quietly. "Maybe not, but it makes me untouchable." From outside came a sound that made all 3 students freeze, a high, piercing whinny that seemed to carry impossible distances. It was followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood, as if something large had just broken through a fence. "What the hell was that?" Tyler Reed appeared at the end of the hallway, having finally noticed his friend's absence from their shared math class. "Sounded like a horse," Ruby said, moving to the window. "But there aren't any stables near the school." Esperanza felt a strange chill run down her spine. She had grown up around horses, spent countless hours at her uncle's ranch. That wasn't the sound of a domestic animal. It was wild, untamed, and very, very angry. "Probably just some old nag that got loose from the Patterson farm," Bryce said dismissively. "Anyway, we're done here, for now." He turned to leave, Tyler falling into step beside him. But as they walked away, Bryce called back over his shoulder. "Think about what I said, Wheels. About proving yourself. Maybe it's time you stopped hiding behind that chair." The 2 boys disappeared around the corner, their laughter fading into the distance. Ruby immediately turned to Esperanza, her face creased with concern. "Are you okay? What did he say to you?" The usual garbage, that I'm faking, that I get special treatment, that I'm... Esperanza's voice caught. That I'm broken. Ruby's eyes flashed with fury. You're not broken. You're the strongest person I know. You get up every day and face idiots like him with more grace than they deserve. Sometimes I don't feel strong. Sometimes I feel exactly like what he said, defective. Don't you dare let him get in your head like that. Bryce Anderson is everything wrong with this place. He thinks his daddy's money makes him king of the world. Another sound from outside interrupted them. Not hooves this time, but the slam of car doors and raised voices. Through the window they could see several pickup trucks pulling into the faculty parking lot. Men in work clothes and cowboy hats climbed out, their faces grim and purposeful. That's Sheriff Rodriguez, Ruby said, recognizing the lead figure. And that's Tom Bradley's dad and Pete Sullivan. What are they doing here? Esperanza wheeled closer to the window. She recognized most of the men as local ranchers and horse handlers. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who had worked together before, checking equipment and speaking in low, urgent tones. Something's wrong, she murmured. Principal Walsh emerged from the main office, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. She spoke briefly with Sheriff Rodriguez, her gestures animated and concerned. Even from a distance, it was clear she was agitated about something. We should get to class, Ruby said reluctantly. Whatever's happening out there, it's not our problem. But Esperanza couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to her somehow. The timing seemed too coincidental. The strange behavior of the men, the wild horse cry they had heard, the sense of electricity in the air that made her skin prickle with awareness. In her afternoon English class, Esperanza tried to focus on Ms. Lopez's discussion of symbolism in literature, but her attention kept drifting to the windows. The parking lot was visible from her seat, and she could see more vehicles arriving. A horse trailer, several men on horseback, and what looked like tranquilizer equipment. Miss Flores, Ms. Lopez called out, "Can you give us an example of a symbol that represents protection in the novel we're reading?" "The mockingbird," Esperanza answered automatically. "It represents innocence and the idea that some things should be protected rather than destroyed." "Excellent. And why do you think Harper Lee chose that particular symbol? Because mockingbirds don't harm anyone. They just sing and bring beauty to the world. Killing them would be a sin because they're defenseless." Ms. Lopez nodded approvingly, but Esperanza barely heard her response. Outside, she could see Sheriff Rodriguez pointing toward Thunder Ridge, his expression serious as he spoke to the assembled men. The final bell of the day couldn't come soon enough. As students streamed out of Eagles Peak High School, Esperanza made her way toward the wheelchair-accessible exit, avoiding the main doors where crowds of teenagers pushed and shoved their way to freedom. She had almost reached her father's truck when she heard Tyler Reed's voice behind her. "Hey, Wheels, wait up!" Esperanza's blood ran cold. She looked around for Ruby, but her friend had already been picked up by her grandmother for a dentist appointment. The parking lot was busy with dismissal activity, but no one seemed to be paying attention to her situation. Tyler jogged up beside her, slightly out of breath. "Bryce wants to talk to you." "I have nothing to say to Bryce." "Yeah, well, he has something to say to you, and trust me, you want to hear this. It's about your little performance this morning." "What performance?" "The whole wounded victim act. Bryce thinks you need to learn what real hardship looks like." Esperanza's hands trembled as she gripped her wheelchair rims. "Where is he?" "Behind the gym, away from all the teachers and goody two-shoes who might interfere." Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to get in her father's truck and go home. But another part of her, the part that had been building anger all day, wanted to face Bryce Anderson once and for all. "Fine," she said, "but this ends today, whatever his problem is. With me, we settle it now." Tyler's grin was wolfish. "Oh, it'll be settled all right." They made their way around the building, past the football field and the maintenance sheds. The area behind the gymnasium was isolated, hidden from view by large dumpsters and emergency equipment. Bryce was waiting there with two other football players Esperanza didn't recognize. "Look who decided to show up," Bryce said as they approached. "I wasn't sure you'd have the guts." "What do you want, Bryce?" "I want you to understand something. This school, this town, it has a natural order. People like me, we're at the top. Because we've earned it. We're strong, we're capable, we don't need special help with everything. And people like me, people like you are supposed to know your place. But lately you've been getting ideas above your station. Walking around like you belong here, like you're just as good as everyone else." The cruelty in his words hit her like a physical blow. But beneath the hurt, Esperanza felt something else stirring. A fire that had been building all day, fed by every slight, every dismissive comment, every moment of being treated as less than human. "I do belong here," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I belong here just as much as you do." "Do you? Let's test that theory." Bryce stepped forward and without warning grabbed the handles of her wheelchair. With a sharp jerk, he tilted it backward. Esperanza's arms flew out for balance as the chair teetered on its back wheels. "Stop!" she gasped, but Bryce only laughed. "What's wrong? I thought you said you belonged here. Prove it. Get up and walk away." The chair tilted further back. Esperanza could feel herself starting to slide. Her grip on the armrests slipping as gravity pulled her toward the concrete. That was when they heard it. A sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. A rumbling that grew louder and more menacing with each passing second. The thunder of hooves moving fast and getting closer. "What the hell?" one of the unnamed football players said, looking around nervously. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the sharp whistle of wind and the crack of branches breaking. Something was coming through the forest that bordered the school property. Something large and moving with deadly purpose. Bryce's grip on the wheelchair handles loosened slightly as he tried to locate the source of the noise. It was the opening Esperanza needed. She threw her weight forward, bringing the chair down on all four wheels with a jarring impact. The thundering grew closer. Through the trees at the edge of the school property, they could see movement, large dark shapes moving between the trunks with predatory grace. "We should get out of here," Tyler said, his voice tight with nervous energy. But it was too late. The forest exploded with motion as Tornado burst through the tree line, his massive frame silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. The stallion's eyes were wild, his nostrils flared, and every muscle in his powerful body was tensed for violence. Behind him came Sheriff Rodriguez and three other men on horseback, their faces grim as they tried to keep pace with the enraged Mustang. "Nobody move!" the sheriff shouted. "That horse is extremely agitated." But Tornado wasn't looking at the sheriff or his men. His dark eyes were fixed on the group behind the gymnasium, specifically on the boy who still had his hands on Esperanza's wheelchair. The stallion's head lowered, his ears pinned back against his skull. A sound rumbled from deep in his chest. Part whinny and part growl, a noise that spoke of ancient rage and protective fury. For the first time since Esperanza had known him, Bryce Anderson looked genuinely afraid. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Tornado stood 30 yards away, his massive chest heaving with each breath, his dark coat glistening with sweat from his desperate race down the mountain. The stallion's gaze never wavered from Bryce's hands, still gripping Esperanza's wheelchair. Sheriff Rodriguez dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. Behind him, the other horsemen spread out in a loose semicircle, blocking potential escape routes while keeping their distance from the agitated Mustang. "Son, I need you to step away from the girl," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in law enforcement. "Real slow and easy." Bryce's face had gone pale, but his grip on the wheelchair remained tight. Pride warred. with fear as he processed the impossibility of the situation. Wild horses didn't behave this way. They didn't track down specific humans. They didn't show up at schools like some kind of avenging spirit. "This is insane," he muttered. "It's just a horse." Tornado snorted, a sound like steam escaping from a locomotive. His front hoof pawed the ground, leaving deep gouges in the earth. The message was clear even to someone with no experience around horses. This was a warning. "That's no ordinary horse," Pete Sullivan said quietly, his weathered hands steady on his reins. "That's the Thunder Ridge stallion. Been free up there for near 15 years. Never came down to human settlements before, not once." "Why now?" Sheriff Rodriguez asked, though his eyes never left the unfolding confrontation. Pete studied the scene, taking in Esperanza's frightened expression, Bryce's aggressive posture, the obvious tension between them. Something's got him riled up. Horses got instincts about these things. They can sense when something ain't right. Tyler and the other football players had backed away, putting distance between themselves and the increasingly volatile situation. Their earlier bravado had evaporated in the face of genuine danger. "Bryce," Tyler called out, his voice shaky. "Just let her go, man. This is getting crazy." But Bryce seemed frozen, caught between his need to maintain dominance and his growing awareness that he was in over his head. The wheelchair felt like an anchor in his hands, connecting him to a situation he couldn't control or understand. Esperanza could feel the tension in his grip, the way his fingers tightened and loosened as he wrestled with indecision. She had never been this close to something truly wild before. Tornado's presence filled the air with an energy that made her skin prickle. With electricity. "He's protecting me," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "What?" Bryce's voice cracked slightly. "The horse. He's been watching me. All this time he's been watching out for me." The truth of it settled in her bones, with absolute certainty. The sounds they had heard during the day, the timing of his appearance, the focused intensity of his attention. This magnificent creature had somehow appointed himself as her guardian. Tornado took a step forward, then another. His movements were fluid despite his size, each hoof placement calculated and purposeful. Sheriff Rodriguez tensed, his hand moving, instinctively toward the tranquilizer gun attached to his saddle. "Nobody make any sudden moves," he commanded. "That stallion could kill someone if he charges." "He won't hurt me," Esperanza said with quiet conviction. "He's not here for me." As if responding to her words, Tornado's attention shifted fully to Bryce, the stallion's head lowered until his eyes were level with the teenager's face. The intelligence there was unmistakable, along with something far more dangerous. Judgment. Bryce's hands began to shake. Whatever power he had derived from his size, his social status, his family's wealth, it meant nothing to this creature. Tornado saw him for exactly what he was, a predator threatening something under the stallion's protection. Let her go. The voice belonged to Ruby, who had appeared at the edge of the scene with several other students. Word was spreading through the school about the confrontation behind the gymnasium, drawing curious onlookers despite the obvious danger. "Ruby, stay back," Esperanza called out. "Don't get any closer. I'm not leaving you alone with him." "The horse situation is under control," Sheriff Rodriguez announced, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Everyone needs to clear the area immediately." But the crowd continued to grow. Teachers emerged from the school building, drawn by the commotion and the sight of mounted men on school property. Principal Walsh appeared with Coach Bradley, both looking bewildered by the surreal scene unfolding behind their institution. "What in God's name is happening here?" Walsh demanded. "Wild stallion came down from Thunder Ridge," Pete Sullivan explained. "Seems to have taken an interest in your students." Coach Bradley studied the tableau with the eye of someone who had spent years managing teenage conflicts. The positioning, the body language, the obvious fear radiating from the football players. "This isn't about the horse," he said slowly. "This is about what was happening before the horse showed up." Principal Walsh followed his gaze to where Bryce still gripped Esperanza's wheelchair, to the girl's frightened expression, to the guilty faces of the other boys. Understanding dawned across her features like sunrise. "Mr. Anderson, release that. Wheelchair immediately." "I can't," Bryce said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I let go, that thing might charge. That thing, as you call it, wouldn't be here if you hadn't been terrorizing Miss Flores." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Around the growing crowd, students and teachers began to piece together the situation. The star football player, the girl in the wheelchair, the wild horse that had somehow sensed trouble and come running. Tornado took another step forward. His breath misted in the cool afternoon air as he studied Bryce with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The stallion's muscles rippled beneath his dark coat, power held in check by intelligence and purpose. "Please," Esperanza said softly, "just let me go. This doesn't have to get worse." For a moment, something human flickered in Bryce's eyes. Recognition of how far he had pushed things, of how badly he had misjudged the situation. But then his jaw tightened with familiar stubbornness. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to be intimidated by some overgrown pony." The words were barely out of his mouth when Tornado exploded into motion. Not a charge, but a display of power that made the earth shake beneath their feet. The stallion reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves slashing the air inches from Bryce's face. The sound of his whinny split the afternoon like a battle cry. Bryce stumbled backward, his hands finally releasing their grip on the wheelchair. Esperanza rolled forward, putting distance between herself and her tormentor as chaos erupted around them. Students screamed and scattered. Teachers shouted orders that no one followed. Sheriff Rodriguez spurred his horse forward, trying to position himself between Tornado and the crowd of panicking teenagers. But Tornado wasn't pursuing. Having made his point, the stallion settled back on all fours and turned his attention to Esperanza. His approach was gentle now, almost tentative, as if he understood the difference between threatening predators and protecting the innocent. "Easy, boy," Esperanza whispered, extending her hand palm up in the universal gesture of peace. "Easy." Tornado's massive head lowered until his muzzle was inches from her palm. His breath was warm against her skin as he investigated her scent, confirming what his instincts had already told him. This was his charge, his responsibility, his protected one. The contact lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. In that brief moment, Esperanza felt a connection to something wild and free, something that had chosen to care about her welfare when the human world had failed her. "Incredible," Dr. Sarah Thompson breathed from her position near the crowd. The veterinarian had arrived with the rescue team, expecting to tranquilize a dangerous animal. Instead, she was witnessing something that challenged everything she knew about equine behavior. "I've never seen anything like it," Pete Sullivan agreed. "That horse bonded with her somehow. Doesn't make sense, but there it is." Sheriff Rodriguez kept his weapon ready, but made no move to use it. The situation had stabilized for the moment, but he knew how quickly things could turn deadly with a wild animal involved. Bryce had backed away to where his friends waited, his face a mixture of humiliation and rage. The confrontation hadn't gone as planned. Instead of establishing his dominance, he had been reduced to cowering before a horse while half the school watched. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked their earlier venom. "You can't have that thing following you around forever." "Maybe not," Esperanza replied, her confidence strengthened by Tornado's presence. "But he's here now, and everyone saw what happened when you tried to hurt me." The truth of it rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Cell phones emerged, capturing photos and videos that would be shared across social media within minutes. The story would spread beyond Eagles Peak High School, beyond Willow Creek, carrying with it a message about consequences and protection that no one would soon forget. Principal Walsh stepped forward, her administrative training finally catching up with the unprecedented situation. Everyone needs to return to the building immediately. We're going into lockdown until this situation is resolved. What about the girl? Coach Bradley asked, nodding toward Esperanza. She stays right where she is, Sheriff Rodriguez decided. That horse is calm as long as she's safe. We don't want to upset that balance. As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Ruby lingered at the edge of the safe zone. Esperanza, are you okay? I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. What happens now? Esperanza looked up at Tornado, who had positioned himself between her and the school building like a living barrier. The stallion's ears were pricked forward, alert for any sign of renewed threat. I don't know, she admitted, but I'm not afraid anymore. The words carried a weight that surprised her. For years, she had navigated the world with careful calculation, avoiding confrontation, accepting lesser treatment rather than risking conflict. But something had changed in the span of an afternoon. Something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of her own worth and her right to occupy space in the world. The horse can't stay here indefinitely, Principal Walsh said to Sheriff Rodriguez. This is a school, not a wildlife sanctuary. I know that. But forcing him to leave could trigger another episode. We need to handle this carefully. Dr. Thompson approached with a tranquilizer rifle, her movements slow and non-threatening. I can sedate him if necessary, but I'd prefer to find a way to encourage him to leave on his own. He'll leave when he's ready, Pete Sullivan said, with the certainty of someone who had spent decades working with horses. When he's satisfied that she's safe. And when will that be? Pete studied Tornado's alert posture, the way his attention shifted constantly between Esperanza and the school building. When those boys understand that hurting her has consequences, real consequences. As if responding to his words, Tornado lifted his head and fixed his gaze on the building where Bryce and his friends had taken refuge. The message was clear. He was watching, he was waiting, and he would not forget. The standoff had begun, and nobody knew how it would end. 2 hours had passed since the initial confrontation, and Tornado showed no signs of leaving. The stallion had settled into a protective stance 20 feet from where Esperanza sat in her wheelchair, his alert gaze sweeping the school grounds with military precision. Every few minutes, his ears would twitch towards sounds from inside the building, cataloging voices and footsteps with the attention of a sentry on duty. The parking lot had become a staging area for what looked like a small-scale emergency response. Sheriff Rodriguez had called in additional deputies. Dr. Thompson had summoned 2 other veterinarians from neighboring counties, and Principal Walsh was fielding phone calls from concerned parents who had heard about the situation through the local news. This is unprecedented, Dr. Margaret Foster, an animal behaviorist from the State University, said as she observed Tornado through binoculars. Wild horses don't form protective bonds with humans they've never directly interacted with. The behavior suggests a level of cognitive processing that challenges our understanding of equine psychology. Maybe our understanding needs challenging, Pete Sullivan replied dryly. I've been around horses my whole life, and I'm telling you, that stallion knows exactly what he's doing. Esperanza had been moved to a safer position near the school's main entrance, close enough to maintain Tornado's calm, but far enough from the building to give the authorities room to work. Ruby had been allowed to stay with her, along with Mrs. Lutia Flores, who had arrived in a state of controlled panic after receiving Principal Walsh's emergency call. Mija, are you hurt? Lucia had asked, her hands trembling as she checked her daughter for injuries. When they called and said there was a wild horse, "I'm fine, Mama. He didn't hurt me. He protected me." Lucia looked out at the magnificent stallion with a mixture of awe and concern. As a veterinary assistant, she understood animal behavior well enough to recognize that what they were witnessing defied conventional explanation. But why you? Why would a wild horse care about protecting you? Esperanza had been asking herself the same question. The logical part of her mind insisted. It was coincidence that Tornado had simply been in the area when the confrontation occurred. But a deeper instinct, something primal and certain, told her otherwise. "I think he's been watching me for a while. Uncle David always said horses can sense things about people. Maybe he sensed that I needed protection." Inside the school building, Bryce paced the hallway like a caged animal. The lockdown had trapped him with his humiliation, surrounded by classmates who had witnessed his public defeat. Whispered conversations stopped when he passed, replaced by sidelong glances and barely concealed smirks. "This is ridiculous," he said to Tyler, who had remained loyally by his side, despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. "They can't keep us locked in here forever because of some crazy horse." "Maybe we should just lay low until it's over," Tyler suggested. "Let things cool down." Lay low? That freak and her pet monster just made me look like an idiot in front of the entire school. "You think I'm gonna just let that slide?" Tyler shifted uncomfortably. The afternoon's events had shaken his confidence in Bryce's leadership. There had been something genuinely terrifying about the stallion's focused rage, something that suggested consequences far beyond their usual teenage power games. "What are you going to do? Fight a horse?" "I'm going to show everyone that I'm not afraid of some overgrown pony, and I'm going to make sure that little cripple understands her place in the food chain." Down the hall, Marcus Johnson sat alone, in the library, pretending to study while actually processing what he had witnessed. As Bryce's younger brother, he had grown up in the shadow of his siblings' aggressive confidence, learning to navigate social situations through careful observation, rather than confrontation. But what he had seen behind the gymnasium troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. The casual cruelty, the entitled assumption that Esperanza deserved whatever treatment she received, the complete lack of empathy for another human being's suffering. "You okay, Marcus?" Josh Turner approached hesitantly, his own discomfort with the day's events evident in his expression. "I don't know. This whole thing is messed up. Your brother's really lost it, hasn't he?" Marcus looked up sharply, defensive instincts warring with his growing unease about Bryce's behavior. "He's not usually like this. I mean, he's always been kind of intense, but this is different," Josh agreed. "This is mean. Really mean." Outside, the situation was reaching a critical point. Tornado had been standing guard for hours, refusing food and water offered by the veterinary team. His dedication was admirable, but unsustainable. Wild horses needed to graze, needed to move, needed to maintain their connection to their herd and territory. "We can't let this continue much longer," Sheriff Rodriguez said to the assembled experts. "That horse is going to collapse from exhaustion, and when he does, we'll have a much more dangerous situation on our hands." "What do you suggest?" Dr. Thompson asked. "We need to remove the source of his agitation. If he's protecting the girl from perceived threats, we need to address those threats directly." Principal Walsh understood the implication immediately. "You want me to suspend Bryce Anderson. I want you to ensure that Miss Flores feels safe in her school environment. If that requires disciplinary action against students who have been threatening her, then yes. Based on what evidence? We have allegations and a horse's behavior. That's not exactly grounds for major disciplinary action against a student from one of our most prominent families." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Antonio Flores, Esperanza's father, who had left work early after hearing about the situation. His weathered face was tight with concern as he took in the scene, his daughter sitting calmly near a wild stallion that showed no signs of aggression toward her, but remained poised to attack anyone who might threaten her. "Esperanza, are you all right?" "I'm okay, Papa, really." Antonio studied Tornado with the experienced eye of someone who had worked with horses his entire life. "That's a magnificent animal. Wild bred, probably descended from the old Spanish stock that roamed these mountains for centuries." "You've seen him before?" Dr. Foster asked. "Heard stories?" "Old Pete there can tell you more, but the local ranchers have been talking about a black stallion on Thunder Ridge for years. Never bothered anyone, never came down to the valley, until today." Pete Sullivan nodded grimly. "Been up there since he was barely more than a colt. His mama was shot by poachers when he was young. Found him half-starved that winter, but he wouldn't let anyone get close enough to help. Survived on his own, built himself a small herd of mares over the years. So he knows what it's like to be vulnerable," Esperanza said quietly, "to need protection and not have it." The insight struck the assembled adults with surprising force. Here was a young girl facing her own daily challenges with mobility and social acceptance, recognizing a kindred spirit in a wild stallion who had also learned to be self-reliant in a hostile world. "That might explain the bonding behavior," Dr. Foster mused. "Animals often respond to shared experiences of vulnerability or survival." As afternoon wore toward evening, the standoff continued. Parents began arriving to collect their children, but the lockdown made normal dismissal procedures impossible. Frustration mounted among students trapped inside the building, and several had begun posting increasingly dramatic updates on social media about being held hostage by a crazy horse. Bryce saw his opportunity in the growing chaos. While teachers focused on managing the unusual dismissal logistics, he slipped away from the main hallway and made his way toward a side exit that would put him on the opposite side of the building. From where Tornado stood guard, Tyler caught up with him near the exit door. "Where are you going? We're supposed to stay inside." "I'm not hiding from some horse anymore. This ends now." "Bryce, don't be stupid. That thing nearly killed you earlier." "Nearly doesn't count, and it caught me off guard. This time I'll be ready." Tyler grabbed his friend's arm. "Ready for what? What are you planning to do?" Bryce shrugged him off, his eyes bright with a dangerous combination of humiliation and determination. "I'm going to prove that it's just an animal. And animals can be scared off if you know how to handle them." Before Tyler could protest further, Bryce pushed through the exit door and stepped into the late afternoon sunlight. The side of the building was deserted, giving him a clear path to the maintenance shed where the groundskeeping equipment was stored. 20 yards away, Tornado's head snapped up. The stallion's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the boy who had threatened his protected one. His ears pinned back against his skull, and a low rumble built in his chest. "He's moving," one of the deputies called out as Tornado began. Walking purposefully around the building, Sheriff Rodriguez cursed under his breath. "Someone's outside. Get on the radio and find out who left the building." But it was too late for radio calls. From the maintenance area came the sharp crack of a starting engine, followed by the mechanical roar of a leaf blower being revved to maximum power. Bryce emerged from behind the shed, the commercial-grade leaf blower strapped to his back like some kind of medieval weapon. The machine's noise was deafening. Designed to move heavy debris with concentrated airflow, his plan was simple. Use the noise and forced air to drive the horse away, demonstrating his dominance over the animal that had humiliated him. "Bryce, no!" Principal Walsh's voice was lost in the mechanical roar as she spotted him through the office windows. Tornado's reaction was immediate and violent. The stallion had spent his life in the wilderness, where sudden loud noises meant predators, danger, threats to his herd. The leaf blower's artificial thunder triggered every survival instinct he possessed. But instead of fleeing, as Bryce had expected, Tornado charged. The stallion covered the distance between them in seconds, his powerful legs driving him forward. with locomotive force. Bryce had just enough time to register his miscalculation before 1,500 pounds of enraged horseflesh slammed into him. The leaf blower went flying, its engine dying as it tumbled across the concrete. Bryce hit the ground hard, his shoulder taking the brunt of the impact as he rolled away from Tornado's striking hooves. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" came over the radio, though no weapons had been discharged. The confusion of the moment had emergency. Responders reacting to the chaos without clear information. Esperanza heard the commotion and immediately began wheeling herself toward the sound, despite her parents' protests. She could sense Tornado's distress, could feel the bond between them stretching taut as his protective instincts overwhelmed. His usually careful intelligence. "Tornado!" she called out as she rounded the corner of the building. "Tornado! Stop!" The stallion froze at the sound of her voice. His head turned toward her, ears forward, as if asking for guidance. Bryce lay motionless on the ground nearby, whether from injury or terror, it was impossible to tell. "It's okay," Esperanza said softly, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I'm safe. You kept me safe." Tornado's breathing gradually slowed as he processed her words and calm demeanor. The immediate threat had been neutralized. His protected one was unharmed, and the mechanical noise that had triggered his attack had stopped. Sheriff Rodriguez approached slowly, his tranquilizer gun ready but not raised. "Miss Flores, can you get him to back away from the boy? He won't hurt Bryce now," Esperanza said with quiet confidence. "He only attacks when someone threatens me. As long as Bryce stays down, Tornado will leave him alone." As if to prove her point, the stallion took several steps backward, putting distance between himself and the fallen teenager while maintaining his protective position near Esperanza. Dr. Thompson hurried to examine Bryce, who was conscious but clearly shaken. Possible concussion, definitely bruised ribs, but nothing life-threatening. He's lucky that horse pulled back when it did. "Lucky?" Bryce groaned as he sat up slowly. "That thing tried to kill me." "That thing," Esperanza replied firmly, "defended me after you spent the entire day trying to hurt me. Maybe it's time you learned the difference." The truth of her words settled over the scene like dust after an explosion. In the span of a few hours, the social dynamics of Eagles Peak High School had been fundamentally altered. Bryce Anderson, the untouchable golden boy, had been brought low by forces he couldn't buy, intimidate, or manipulate, and standing guard. Over it all was Tornado, wild and free, bound to his chosen charge by instincts older than civilization itself. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, its red and blue lights painting the school parking lot in urgent colors. Paramedic Steve Johnson worked efficiently to stabilize Bryce, checking for signs of serious head trauma, while Dr. Thompson provided additional medical context about the nature of his injuries. "Vitals are stable," Johnson reported to Sheriff. "Rodriguez, bruised ribs, possible mild concussion, but he's coherent and responsive. We'll transport him to Copper Valley Medical for a full evaluation." "I don't need a hospital," Bryce protested weakly as the paramedics prepared the stretcher. "I just got knocked down. Son, you were trampled by a 1,500-pound stallion," Dr. Thompson said firmly. "You're getting a full medical workup whether you like it or not." As the ambulance pulled away, its siren wailing across the valley, the assembled crowd finally began to process the magnitude of what had occurred. A student had been seriously injured on school property by a wild animal, creating liability issues that would ripple through the district for months to come. "We need to talk," Robert Anderson's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. Bryce's father had arrived in his expensive pickup truck, his face set in hard lines that promised serious consequences for someone. Principal Walsh stepped forward, her administrative training kicking in despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. Mr. Anderson, I understand your concern, but we need to follow proper protocols here. Protocols? Robert's voice rose dangerously. My son was attacked by a wild animal on your property. Where I come from, that's called negligence. Sheriff Rodriguez positioned himself between the angry father and the school administrator. Mr. Anderson, I know you're upset, but we need to establish the facts before anyone starts throwing around legal accusations. The facts are simple. That horse injured my boy, and someone's going to pay for it. The facts, Esperanza said quietly from her position near Tornado, are that your son spent the entire day terrorizing me. He knocked me out of my wheelchair, threatened me, and then tried to scare away the only thing that was protecting me. Robert Anderson turned his attention to her for the first time, his eyes narrowing as he took in her wheelchair and determined expression. Is that what this is about? Some kind of revenge fantasy because you think Bryce was picking on you? It's not a fantasy. Half the school witnessed it. Witnesses can be mistaken, and wild animals don't just randomly attack people. That horse was probably trained to be aggressive. Pete Sullivan stepped forward, his weathered face creased with disgust. Mr. Anderson, with all due respect, you don't know what you're talking about. That stallion has been wild his entire life. He's never had human contact beyond what he's observed from a distance. Then explain why he targeted my son specifically. Because your son was hurting someone the horse had decided to protect. It's that simple. The argument was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle, this one bearing the logo of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks. District Warden Jennifer Martinez climbed out, her uniform crisp despite the long drive from the county seat. Sheriff Rodriguez, I'm Warden Martinez. I understand we have a situation with a wild horse that's become aggressive toward humans. It's more complicated than that, Rodriguez replied, gesturing toward the ongoing standoff where Tornado maintained his protective vigil near Esperanza. Martinez surveyed the scene with professional assessment, taking in the positions of the various parties, the calm behavior of the stallion, and the obvious tension between the adults. Has the animal shown aggression toward anyone other than the injured student? No, ma'am. In fact, he's been remarkably gentle with Miss Flores here. It's only when someone threatens her that he becomes defensive. Defensive behavior is natural for horses, especially stallions with protective instincts. What concerns me is why a wild horse would form this kind of bond with a human he's never interacted with directly. Dr. Foster, who had been quietly documenting the afternoon's events, looked up from her notes. We're dealing with an unprecedented case of interspecies empathy. The horse seems to recognize Miss Flores as vulnerable and has appointed himself as her guardian. That's ridiculous, Robert Anderson interjected. Horses don't think like that. They're just animals. Animals with complex social structures and emotional intelligence, Dr. Foster replied calmly. Recent research has shown that horses are capable of recognizing human emotions and responding appropriately. What we're seeing here is an extreme example of that capacity. Warden Martinez approached Tornado slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The stallion watched her carefully, but showed no signs of aggression. Beautiful animal, looks like he's in excellent condition despite being wild. He's been surviving on his own for 15 years, Pete Sullivan confirmed. Built himself a small herd up on Thunder Ridge. This is the first time he's ever come down to human settlements, which suggests a powerful motivation for the behavior change. Martinez studied Esperanza thoughtfully. Miss, how long have you been attending this school? Since September. This is my first semester here. And have you noticed the horse watching you before today? Esperanza considered the question carefully. There had been moments, especially during her morning commute, when she had felt observed. A prickling sensation that made her look toward the mountains, though she had never actually seen Tornado during those times. I think so. Sometimes I felt like something was watching me from the ridge. I just thought it was my imagination. Animals often observe potential threats or objects of interest for extended periods before making contact. Your horse may have been assessing you for weeks. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of local news crews, their vans bristling with satellite equipment and camera operators eager to capture footage of the unusual standoff. Within minutes, reporters were pushing microphones toward anyone willing to comment on the situation. This is Rebecca Santos with Channel 7 News, reporting from Eagles Peak High School, where a wild stallion has apparently formed an unusual bond with a disabled student. Principal Walsh immediately moved to intercept the news crews. This is school property. You need to stay behind the barriers and cannot interview students without parental consent. But the damage was already done. The story was spreading across social media platforms, with students posting videos and photos that painted various versions of the day's events. Some portrayed Esperanza as a victim finally receiving justice, while others suggested she had somehow trained the horse to attack. Her classmates, "We need to resolve this situation quickly," Warden Martinez said to Sheriff Rodriguez. "The longer it continues, the more dangerous it becomes for everyone involved. What do you recommend?" The horse needs to return to his territory. The question is how we encourage him to leave without traumatizing either him or the girl. Dr. Thompson had been quietly observing Tornado's behavior patterns. He's showing signs of stress from extended vigilance. Horses aren't designed to maintain this level of alertness for hours at a time. If we don't resolve this soon, he could collapse from exhaustion. "What happens if he collapses here?" Esperanza asked, genuine concern in her voice. "Emergency veterinary intervention, possible sedation, and transportation back to Thunder Ridge by trailer. It would be traumatic for him and potentially dangerous for us." The weight of responsibility settled on Esperanza's shoulders. Tornado had appointed himself as her protector, but his dedication was putting him at risk. She needed to find a way to release him from his self-imposed duty without betraying the trust he had placed in her. "What if I went with him?" she asked. Suddenly, the suggestion caused an immediate uproar among the adults. "Absolutely not," her mother said firmly. "You're not going anywhere near those mountains with a wild horse. But he's not dangerous to me. You've all seen that." "Dangerous or not, he's still a wild animal," her father added, "and you're not equipped to handle wilderness conditions." Warden Martinez studied the proposal more carefully. "Even if we could guarantee your safety, which we can't, removing you from the area might actually increase the horse's agitation. He's taken responsibility for protecting you here. Changing locations could trigger more aggressive behavior." Sheriff Rodriguez's radio crackled with an update from the hospital. "Bryce Anderson has been examined and released. Minor injuries, no permanent damage, but his father is demanding an incident report and talking about pressing charges." "Charges? Against whom?" Dr. Foster asked. "The horse? Against the school district for failing to maintain a safe environment. Possibly against Miss Flores for somehow provoking the animal. The absurdity of the suggestion would have been laughable under other circumstances, but the legal implications were serious. School districts faced lawsuits regularly, and wild animal attacks on school property created unprecedented liability concerns. "He can't charge me with anything," Esperanza said with growing confidence. "I was the victim of bullying. Tornado was protecting me from assault. The problem is proving that—" "In court," Rodriguez replied grimly. "We have witness statements, but the Anderson family has significant influence in this county. They could make things very difficult for everyone involved." As evening approached, the situation showed no signs of resolution. Tornado had accepted small amounts of water from Dr. Thompson, but refused all food offerings. His dedication was admirable, but unsustainable, and everyone present understood that time was running out. "There has to be something we can do," Ruby said to Esperanza as they huddled together near the school entrance. Ruby's grandmother had arrived to collect her, but had agreed to let her stay until the situation was resolved. I keep thinking but I don't know what. I can't ask him to leave when I know Bryce is just going to come after me again tomorrow. Maybe that's the real problem. It's not about the horse at all. It's about feeling safe at school. The simple truth of Ruby's observation struck Esperanza like lightning. Tornado had responded to her fear and vulnerability, but the source of that fear remained unchanged. Until Bryce faced real consequences for his behavior, until the school environment became genuinely safe for her, the stallion would continue to feel the need to protect her. You're right, this doesn't end until the bullying ends. So what do we do about it? Esperanza looked around at the assembled adults, all focused on managing the immediate crisis while ignoring the underlying problem that had caused it. They were treating the symptoms while the disease continued to spread. We make them listen. We make them understand that this happened because the school failed to protect me, and we make sure it never happens to anyone else. As if sensing her resolve, Tornado lifted his head and looked directly at her. In his dark eyes, she saw not just protective instinct, but something deeper: trust, partnership, the recognition that they were allies in a struggle that extended. Far beyond a single afternoon's confrontation, the standoff would continue, but it was no longer just about a girl and her horse. It had become about justice, accountability, and the right of every student to feel safe in their school environment. The battle lines were drawn, and Esperanza Flores was finally ready to fight. The fluorescent lights of the Copper Valley Medical Center cast harsh shadows across the emergency room, where Bryce Anderson sat on the examination table, his ribs wrapped in tight bandages. The painkillers had dulled the physical ache, but they couldn't touch the humiliation that burned in his chest like acid. The X-rays show no fractures. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Principal Walsh's sister, explained as she reviewed his chart. You have significant bruising along your ribcage and a mild concussion. You're lucky that horse held back when it did. Lucky, Bryce muttered, his voice hollow. Right. His parents stood nearby, his mother Linda's face creased with worry, while his father Robert paced the small room like a predator planning his next move. The family dynamic was clear even to the medical staff. Robert Anderson was a man accustomed to controlling situations through force of will and financial influence. When can he return to school? Robert demanded. I'd recommend at least 3 days of rest, possibly longer depending on how the concussion symptoms develop. No physical activity for at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Football playoffs start next month. He can't miss that much practice. Dr. Walsh looked up from her clipboard with the practiced patience of someone who dealt with unrealistic parents regularly. Mr. Anderson, your son was trampled by a horse. His health takes priority over sports schedules. This is all because of that freak in the wheelchair. If the school had proper security protocols, none of this would have happened. Bryce's head snapped up at his father's words. For the first time since the incident, he saw the situation from an outside perspective. The words sounded ugly and cruel when spoken aloud, even though they echoed thoughts he had harbored privately. She didn't do anything wrong, he said quietly. Robert stopped pacing. What did you say? Esperanza. She didn't cause this. I did. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Linda Anderson moved closer to her son, her maternal instincts recognizing something broken in his voice that went beyond physical injury. Bryce, honey, you're hurt and confused. That horse attacked you unprovoked. No, it didn't. The words came out stronger now, driven by a clarity that surprised him. I was hurting her. I knocked her out of her wheelchair this morning. I threatened her. I tried to scare away the only thing that was protecting her. Robert's face flushed red with Anger and embarrassment. You don't know what you're saying. The concussion is affecting your judgment. My judgment was affected before I got hurt. I've been acting like a complete asshole for months, and nobody called me on it because of who we are in this town. Bryce. Linda's shocked voice carried more surprise than reproach. It's true, Mom. I used Dad's money and reputation like a shield, thinking it made me untouchable. But that horse didn't care about our bank account or the Anderson name. It just saw someone hurting a person who couldn't defend herself. Dr. Walsh finished her notes and prepared to leave, but something about the family's dynamic made her pause. As both a medical professional and the sister of the school's principal, she had a unique perspective on the situation. Mr. Anderson, I understand you're considering legal action against the school district. Damn right I am. They allowed a dangerous situation to develop on their property. You might want to consider the full picture before proceeding. My sister mentioned that several students and teachers witnessed the events leading up to the horse's intervention. Their testimony might not support the narrative you're constructing. Robert's jaw tightened. Are you threatening me, Doctor? I'm offering professional advice. Sometimes the best legal strategy is to address the underlying problems rather than escalating the conflict. Back at Eagles Peak High School, the standoff continued into the evening hours. Tornado had finally accepted some food from Pete Sullivan, but his attention remained fixed on the school building where Esperanza sat with her family and supporters. Marcus Johnson stood at one of the hallway windows, watching the scene unfold. With growing unease, his older brother's behavior had been escalating for months, but Marcus had convinced himself it was just typical teenage aggression. Today's events had shattered that comfortable denial. You okay, man? Josh Turner approached quietly, recognizing the distress written across Marcus's features. I knew, Marcus said, without turning from the window. I knew Bryce was picking on her, and I didn't do anything to stop it. You're not responsible for your brother's choices, aren't I? I could have said something. I could have told my parents, or Principal Walsh, or just stood up to him myself, but I was too much of a coward. Josh considered this, his own guilt, weighing heavily on his conscience. We all knew, the whole school knew, but nobody wanted to get involved because it was easier to let someone else be the target. That makes it worse, not better. Yeah, it does. The two boys stood in comfortable silence, processing their complicity in a system that had allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. Around them, other students were having similar conversations, the day's dramatic events forcing them to examine their own roles in the social hierarchy that had enabled Bryce's behavior. In Principal Walsh's office, an emergency meeting was taking place with school board members who had been hastily summoned to address the crisis. The room was crowded with district officials, all struggling to find precedent for their current situation. We need to establish clear protocols for handling this kind of incident, Board President Carol Martinez said, her voice tight with stress. The media attention is already affecting our reputation, and if the Anderson family follows through with their legal threats, the Anderson family should be the least of our concerns right now, countered board member David Foster, Dr. Foster's husband. We have a documented pattern of bullying that we failed to address, culminating in a student being physically knocked from her wheelchair. That's the real liability issue. Alleged bullying, corrected District Superintendent Michael Torres. Until we complete a formal investigation, everything is alleged. There's nothing alleged about the video footage students posted on social media, Walsh replied grimly. Half the school saw Bryce Anderson assault Esperanza Flores. The horse's intervention is just the dramatic conclusion to a story that should have ended months ago with proper disciplinary action. Outside, Warden Martinez had been consulting with her superiors about the unprecedented situation. Wild horse management typically involved relocation or population control, not complex behavioral interventions with human-animal bonding. The department's position is that the horse needs to be removed from the area for public safety, she explained to Sheriff Rodriguez. But tranquilizing and relocating him could traumatize both the animal and the girl he's protecting. What about waiting him out? He can't maintain this level of alertness indefinitely. That's what concerns me. When exhaustion finally overcomes his protective instincts, his behavior could become unpredictable. A tired, stressed stallion is dangerous to everyone in the vicinity. Dr. Thompson had been monitoring Tornado's condition throughout the day, noting the subtle signs of fatigue that were beginning to show despite his determined vigilance. His breathing is becoming more labored, and he's starting to shift his weight more frequently. Those are early indicators of physical stress. How much longer can he sustain this? Hours, not days. And when he finally crashes, the recovery period could be dangerous for everyone. Esperanza had been listening to these conversations with growing anxiety. The horse that had appointed himself as her protector was suffering because of her situation, and that knowledge weighed on her conscience like a stone. "There has to be another way," she said to Ruby, who had remained steadfastly by her side throughout the ordeal. "Maybe there is. What if we could guarantee your safety without Tornado having to stay here?" "How?" Ruby's expression was thoughtful as she worked through the possibilities. What if the real problem isn't Bryce specifically, but the system that allowed him to get away with bullying for so long? If we could change that system, make sure there are real consequences for this kind of behavior, maybe Tornado would understand that you don't need his protection anymore. The idea had merit, but implementing systemic change seemed impossibly complex compared to the simple presence of an angry stallion. Institutions moved slowly, bureaucracy was cumbersome, and powerful families like the Andersons had ways of circumventing consequences. Even if we could change things, how would Tornado know? He's not going to understand policy changes or disciplinary procedures. Animals understand safety. If you genuinely felt safe, if the threat was really gone, maybe he'd sense that and leave on his own. It was a theory worth exploring, but it required something that seemed increasingly unlikely: genuine accountability from both the school system and the Anderson family. At the medical center, Bryce was finally being discharged with strict instructions for rest and follow-up care. His parents maintained their stony silence during the drive home, the family dynamics strained by his unexpected confession of culpability. "We need to discuss what happened today," Robert said as they pulled into their driveway. "I already told you what happened. I was bullying Esperanza Flores, and a horse decided to stop me. Don't be flip about this, Bryce. Your actions today could have serious consequences for our family's reputation in this community." "Good. Maybe it's time people knew who we really are instead of who we pretend to be." Linda turned in her seat to face her son, her expression a mixture of concern and disappointment. "This isn't like you, honey. You've always been such a leader at school." "A leader? Is that what you call it when someone uses their family's money and influence to intimidate people who can't fight back?" The question struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Both parents had encouraged Bryce's aggressive confidence, viewing it as preparation for success in a competitive world. They had never examined the collateral damage caused by their approach to raising a winner. "Sometimes you have to be tough to get ahead in life," Robert said defensively. "Tough? I knocked a girl out of her wheelchair, Dad. That's not tough, that's cruel. There's a difference, even if we've never bothered to learn it." The drive ended in uncomfortable silence, but the conversation continued in the Anderson household long into the evening. For the first time in years, the family was forced to examine the values they had been living by and the example they had set for their children. Back at the school, darkness was falling over the parking lot where Tornado maintained his vigil. Emergency lighting had been brought in to ensure visibility, and the growing crowd of officials, experts, and media representatives showed no signs of dispersing. "We can't maintain this situation overnight," Sheriff Rodriguez said to the assembled group. "The horse needs rest, the girl needs to go home, and we need to restore some semblance of normalcy." "Normalcy?" Esperanza spoke up from her position near Tornado. "There was nothing normal about being knocked out of my wheelchair and threatened by bullies while everyone looked the other way. Maybe normalcy is the problem." Her words carried a weight that silenced the adult conversation. Here was a 14-year-old girl articulating what the grown-ups had been dancing around all afternoon. The crisis wasn't really about a wild horse at all. It was about a system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable members. "What do you want to happen, Miss Flores?" Warden Martinez asked directly. "I want to feel safe at school. I want Bryce Anderson to face real consequences for his actions. And I want other students to know that bullying won't be tolerated, no matter who their parents are or how much money their families donate. Those are reasonable requests, but implementing them takes time. Then maybe Tornado and I will wait." The quiet determination in her voice made it clear that this was no longer a crisis to be managed, but a stand to be taken. The girl in the wheelchair had found her voice, and she wasn't backing down. Dawn broke cold and gray over Eagles Peak High School, where Tornado still maintained his protective stance despite a night of restless vigilance. The stallion's magnificent coat was damp with morning dew, and his movements had become noticeably slower as exhaustion took its toll on his powerful frame. Esperanza had spent the night in her family's truck, parked within sight of her guardian, catching fragments of sleep between periods of watching over the horse who watched over her. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present, protector and protected, taking turns standing guard against threats that seemed to multiply rather than diminish. "This can't continue," Dr. Thompson said quietly to the small group of officials who had maintained an overnight vigil. "His vital signs are showing dangerous levels of stress. If he collapses, we'll need immediate veterinary intervention." Sheriff Rodriguez nodded grimly as he sipped coffee from a thermos. "Any word from the school board about their emergency session?" "They've been meeting since midnight," Principal Walsh replied, her own fatigue evident in the dark circles under her eyes. "Superintendent Torres is pushing for a quick resolution that protects the district's liability exposure. And the Anderson family? Robert Anderson has retained Mitchell, Stern and Associates. They're the most aggressive litigation firm in the state." The mention of the law firm sent a ripple of concern through the assembled group. Mitchell, Stern and Associates had a reputation for crushing opponents through superior resources and relentless legal pressure. Their involvement suggested the Anderson family was preparing for total war rather than seeking resolution. "What about the boy himself?" Dr. Foster asked. "Has anyone spoken to Bryce directly?" "His father's not allowing any contact. All communication has to go through their attorneys now." What the officials didn't know was that Bryce Anderson was at that moment sitting in his bedroom, staring out at Thunder Ridge, where Tornado's herd grazed in the distance. The painkillers had worn off during the night, leaving him with physical discomfort that paled beside the emotional turmoil raging in his chest. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from teammates and friends, most expressing support for his version of events while condemning the crazy horse that had attacked him. But scattered among the predictable responses were a few that cut deeper. Messages from classmates who had witnessed his behavior and weren't buying the victim narrative his family was constructing. "Saw what you did to her wheelchair. Horse was right to stop you. Anonymous. Maybe if you hadn't been such a bully, none of this would have happened. Someone who knew Esperanza never hurt anyone. Why did you have to be so mean?" Truth speaker. Each message was like a mirror held up to his actions, reflecting back an image of himself that he was only beginning to recognize. The confident, entitled teenager who had awakened yesterday morning felt like a stranger now, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the weight of his choices. A soft knock on his door interrupted his brooding. "Bryce, can I come in?" His mother's voice was tentative, uncertain how to navigate this new dynamic between them. "Yeah, Mom." Linda Anderson entered, carrying a breakfast tray, her movements careful as she assessed her son's mood. The family had spent hours the previous evening in heated discussion about legal strategy, with Bryce increasingly resistant to his father's aggressive approach. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Like I got trampled by a horse," he said, with bitter humor. "But that's not the worst part." "What is?" "The worst part is knowing I deserved it." Linda set the tray down and sat on the edge of the bed, her maternal instincts warring with years of conditioning that taught her to defend her family regardless of circumstances. "Honey, you're hurt and confused. That animal could have killed you, but it didn't. It could have, but it didn't. Do you know why? Because someone scared it off. Because it wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to stop me from hurting someone else. There's a difference." The distinction was lost on Linda, who had spent her adult life viewing the world through the lens of Anderson family interests. The idea that her son might actually be in the wrong challenged assumptions she had never questioned. At the school, a caravan of vehicles was arriving for what everyone understood would be a decisive day. The Montana Department of Education had sent representatives to assess the situation, Child Protective Services had been notified due to the bullying allegations, and several advocacy groups for disabled students had appeared overnight. "This is getting out of hand," Superintendent Torres muttered as he surveyed the growing crowd. "We need to control the narrative before it spirals completely out of our control." "The narrative is already established," replied Sarah Mitchell, from the Montana Disability Rights Coalition. "A disabled student was assaulted on school property, and the only intervention came from a wild animal. That tells us everything we need to know about your institutional priorities. Now see here, that's not fair. We have comprehensive anti-bullying policies in place. Policies that apparently weren't worth the paper they're printed on when it came to protecting Esperanza Flores." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of another official vehicle, this one carrying State Representative Maria Santos, who had driven through the night after hearing about the situation from concerned constituents. Representative Santos, Principal Walsh said with obvious nervousness, "We weren't expecting state-level involvement. When a disabled child is assaulted at school and the only justice comes from a wild horse, that becomes a state-level concern," Santos replied firmly. "I want to speak with Miss Flores immediately." Esperanza had been watching the morning's developments with growing amazement. What had started as a personal conflict between her and a school bully had somehow evolved into a statewide discussion about disability rights, institutional accountability, and the protection of vulnerable students. "Miss Flores, I'm Maria Santos. I serve this district in the state legislature, and I'm here because what happened to you should never happen to any student." "Thank you for coming, Representative Santos, but I'm not sure what you can do that hasn't already been tried. I can ensure that your voice is heard at the highest levels of state government, and I can guarantee that the changes you're demanding here become models for schools across Montana." The promise carried weight that surprised Esperanza. She had expected to fight this battle alone, with only Ruby and Tornado as allies. The growing coalition of supporters felt overwhelming and empowering at the same time. What kind of changes are we talking about? Mandatory reporting requirements for bullying incidents, independent oversight of disciplinary actions, specific protections for students with disabilities, real consequences that can't be circumvented by wealthy families or influential donors. As if summoned by the mention of wealthy families, Robert, Anderson's luxury SUV pulled into the parking lot, followed by a second vehicle carrying his legal team. The sight of their arrival sent a visible tension through the assembled crowd. "Mr. Anderson," Sheriff Rodriguez called out as Robert approached. "The group, I hope you're here to discuss resolution rather than escalation. I'm here to protect my family's interests and ensure that justice is served." "Justice?" Representative Santos stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of elected office. "Your son assaulted a disabled student. Justice would be accountability and restitution. My son was attacked by a dangerous animal that should have been contained. Any prior incidents were typical teenage conflicts that have been blown out of proportion. Typical teenage conflicts don't involve knocking disabled students out of their wheelchairs," Santos replied coldly. The confrontation was interrupted by an unexpected voice from the crowd. "Dad, stop!" Everyone turned to see Bryce Anderson approaching, moving slowly due to his injuries, but with unmistakable determination. His arrival sent a shock through both supporters and opponents of his family's position. "Bryce, get back in the car," Robert commanded. "You're not supposed to be here." "I need to be here. I need to make this right. You don't need to do anything. Except let the lawyers handle this situation. The lawyers can't handle what I did to Esperanza. Only I can do that." Bryce walked past his father toward where Esperanza sat near Tornado, who had lifted his head at the approach of the boy who had threatened his protected one. The stallion's muscles tensed, but his aggressive posture was tempered by exhaustion and perhaps recognition that this encounter felt different from the previous day's confrontations. "Esperanza, I need to talk to you. I'm listening. I'm sorry. Not because my lawyers told me to say it or because I got hurt, but because what I did to you was wrong, really deeply wrong." The apology hung in the morning air like mist, visible to everyone present. Around them, cameras captured the moment as cell phones recorded what would become a viral video within hours. "I don't just mean yesterday, I mean everything. The comments, the looks, the way I treated you like you were less than human because you use a wheelchair. None of that was okay." Esperanza studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or performance. What she saw instead was something she had never expected from Bryce Anderson: genuine remorse. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I'm standing here, even though my father told me not to. Because I'm admitting things that are going to cost my family money and reputation. Because that horse over there taught me something about protecting people instead of hurting them." Tornado's head turned toward Bryce at the mention of his role in the situation. The stallion's dark eyes seemed to assess the sincerity of the boy's words, weighing intention against past behavior. "What do you want from me?" Esperanza asked. "I want you to feel safe at school. I want you to know that I'm never going to hurt you or anyone else again. And I want to help fix the system that let me get away with being a bully for so long." The offer was unexpected and carried implications that rippled through the assembled crowd. Robert Anderson's face had gone pale as he realized his son was dismantling the family's legal strategy in real time. "Bryce, you need to stop talking right now," one of the lawyers interjected. "No, I don't. I need to keep talking until everyone understands what really happened here." Representative Santos stepped closer, recognizing an opportunity to cement the changes she had been advocating. "Are you willing to testify about the bullying culture at this school to help us understand how these situations develop and persist?" "Yes, I'll testify. I'll cooperate with any investigation, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen to other students." "Bryce." Robert's voice cracked with anger and desperation. "You're destroying everything we've worked for. We worked for the wrong things, Dad. Money and influence don't matter if you use them to hurt people." The confrontation between father and son played out in front of the assembled crowd, capturing in microcosm the larger conflict between accountability and privilege that had brought everyone to this moment. Tornado, perhaps sensing that the immediate threat to his protected one was diminishing, finally allowed himself to show signs of the exhaustion that had been building throughout his vigil. The stallion's legs trembled slightly as he lowered his massive head, and Dr. Thompson immediately moved to assess his condition. "He's reaching his physical limits," she announced. "We need to get him water and see if he'll accept some high-energy feed." "Will he leave now?" Esperanza asked, torn between gratitude for his protection and concern for his well-being. "That depends on whether he believes the threat has passed." All eyes turned to Bryce, who stood at the center of a situation that had spiraled far beyond anything he could have imagined when he had first decided to torment a girl in a wheelchair. "I swear to you, Esperanza, and to everyone here, that I will never hurt you again, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure no one else does either." The promise carried weight that surprised even him. In making it, Bryce Anderson had crossed a line from which there could be no return to his old life of entitled cruelty. He had chosen accountability over privilege, and the choice would define him for years to come. Tornado lifted his head one final time, his intelligent eyes moving between Esperanza and Bryce as if measuring the sincerity of the moment. Then, with a soft whinny that seemed to carry both farewell and blessing, the great stallion turned toward Thunder Ridge. His departure was as dramatic as his arrival had been, but this time he moved with purpose rather than fury. The Guardians' work was done, his protected one was safe, and the mountain was calling him home. Tornado had taken only a dozen steps toward Thunder Ridge when the sound of screeching tires shattered the morning calm. A battered pickup truck careened into the school parking lot, its engine smoking and its driver clearly in distress. The vehicle lurched to a stop near the crowd, and Tom Bradley, Coach Bradley's older brother, stumbled out. "That stallion's herd is in trouble," he gasped, his face pale with exertion and worry. "Poachers up on the ridge. They've got the mares cornered in Devil's Canyon." The news hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Pete Sullivan was the first to react, his weathered face hardening with fury. "How many?" "At least 3 men with rifles, maybe more. They've been planning this for weeks, waiting for the stallion to leave his territory. Soon as word spread that he was down here, they moved in." Tornado's head snapped up at the mention of his herd, some instinctive understanding of the threat, communicated through tone and body language. The stallion's exhaustion seemed to melt away, replaced by desperate urgency as he began moving toward the mountain with renewed strength. "He'll never make it in time," Dr. Thompson said, her professional assessment cutting through the emotional reaction. "He's been standing guard for 18 hours. His body is running on adrenaline now, but when that crashes, then we go after them ourselves," Pete declared, heading toward his own truck. "Tom, how many men you got with you?" 5 ranch hands, all armed and ready, but we need more if we're going up against professional poachers." Sheriff Rodriguez was already on his radio, calling for backup and wildlife enforcement officers, but everyone present understood the mathematics of the situation. It would take hours to coordinate an official response, and the mares didn't have hours. Esperanza felt the blood drain from her face as she processed the implications. Tornado had exhausted himself protecting her, and now his family was paying the price for his dedication. The guilt hit her like a physical weight, crushing and immediate. "This is my fault," she whispered. "No, it's not," Ruby said firmly, gripping her friend's shoulder. "This is the fault of criminals who prey on wild animals. But if Tornado hadn't been here, if he hadn't been protecting me, if he hadn't been protecting you, those poachers would have found another opportunity. Criminals like that don't stop because their first plan fails." The logic was sound, but it did nothing to ease the crushing sense of responsibility. Esperanza Velt, the magnificent creature who had appointed himself as her guardian, was now torn between protecting her and saving his family, and either choice carried devastating consequences. "I have to go with him," she said suddenly. The declaration caused an immediate uproar among the adults. "Absolutely not," her father said firmly. "You're not going anywhere near those mountains." "Papa, you don't understand. Tornado is exhausted. Because of me. If I'm there, if he knows I'm safe, maybe he can focus on saving his herd." "Miss Flores, with all due respect, a wheelchair can't navigate mountain terrain," Warden Martinez said gently. "You'd be putting yourself and others at risk." "Then we bring the terrain to me. Uncle David has that all-terrain vehicle he uses. For hunting, it's got tracks instead of wheels, designed for rough country." The suggestion was audacious and dangerous, but it addressed the core problem everyone was dancing around: Tornado's divided attention between protecting Esperanza and saving his herd. David Flores, who had arrived an hour earlier, studied his niece with a mixture of pride and concern. That ATV could handle the lower mountain trails, but getting to Devil's Canyon would be rough even for experienced riders. "I've been riding with you since I was 8 years old. I know those mountains. Not from a wheelchair, you don't. Then teach me. We have 20 minutes while everyone gets organized. Show me what I need to know." The debate that followed was heated and multi-layered, touching on liability issues, safety concerns, and the ethics of involving a disabled teenager in what was essentially a vigilante rescue operation. But underlying all the rational arguments was an emotional truth that everyone recognized. Tornado had sacrificed everything to protect Esperanza, and now it was her turn to help him. Representative Santos surprised everyone by supporting the proposal. "Miss Flores has demonstrated remarkable courage and judgment throughout this crisis. If she believes her presence could help save those horses, we should consider her perspective seriously." "You're talking about putting a child in danger," Robert Anderson interjected, his own family crisis temporarily forgotten in the face of the larger emergency. "I'm talking about honoring the bond between a protector and the person he chose to protect," Santos replied. "Sometimes extraordinary situations require extraordinary responses." Bryce, who had been watching the debate with growing understanding, stepped forward despite his injuries. "I'll go with her. Son, you can barely walk," Pete Sullivan observed. "I can sit on an ATV and handle a radio, and if anything goes wrong, I can make sure she gets to safety first." The offer was unexpected and carried implications that went far beyond practical assistance. Here was the former bully volunteering to risk his own safety to help the girl he had tormented, creating a symmetry that felt almost mythic in its significance. "Why?" Esperanza asked directly. "Because that horse taught me something about protecting people instead of hurting them. Maybe it's time I put that lesson into practice." The decision was made through a combination of necessity, emotion, and the recognition that conventional responses were inadequate for an unconventional situation. Within 30 minutes, a convoy was organized. Pete Sullivan and his ranch hands. In the lead vehicles, Sheriff Rodriguez and his deputies providing official oversight, and David Flores' modified ATV carrying Esperanza and Bryce toward an uncertain confrontation in the Montana wilderness. Tornado had already disappeared into the tree line, his powerful legs carrying him up trails that no human vehicle could follow. But the lower mountain roads provided an alternative route that could get the rescue party close to Devil's Canyon, where the sound of gunfire was already echoing across the valley. 3 shots, Pete announced over the radio. That means they've started culling the herd. The words sent a chill through everyone who heard them. Wild horse poaching was brutal and efficient, focused on harvesting valuable parts rather than preserving the animals' lives. Every minute that passed meant more mares were dying. The ATV bounced and lurched over terrain that would have been impossible for a standard wheelchair, but the tracked vehicle handled the rough mountain trails. With surprising stability, Esperanza gripped the safety harness tightly, her body protesting the jarring motion while her mind focused on the task ahead. "You okay?" Bryce asked through the helmet radio. "Better than okay. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing something that really matters." "Yeah, me too." The admission carried weight between them, acknowledgement of how far they had both traveled from the confrontation that had started this journey. The bully and his victim, united now in purpose and danger, racing toward a mountain where justice would be measured in lives saved rather than lessons learned. They reached the staging area below Devil's Canyon just as Tornado burst from the forest ahead of them, his magnificent form silhouetted against the granite cliffs where his herd was. Trapped. The stallion was moving on pure determination now, his exhaustion evident in every stride, but his commitment absolute. There, Pete pointed toward the canyon mouth where armed figures were positioned behind makeshift barriers. 3 shooters, just like Tom said. They've got the mares pinned against the back wall. The tactical situation was clear through binoculars. The poachers had chosen their position well, using the natural geography to trap the horses while providing themselves with cover and escape routes. It was a professional operation, planned and executed with military precision. "Sheriff, we need to coordinate our approach," Warden Martinez said over the radio. "These aren't amateur hunters. They're organized and dangerous." "Copy that. All units maintain position until we can establish a perimeter," but Tornado had no interest in tactical coordination. The stallion's desperate whinny echoed across the canyon as he caught sight of his herd, trapped and terrified against the stone walls. Without hesitation, he charged directly toward the poacher's position. "He's going to get himself killed." Dr. Thompson breathed. The stallion's direct assault was magnificent and suicidal, a display of courage that inspired and terrified everyone watching. The poachers turned their weapons toward him, recognizing the threat he represented to their operation. That was when Esperanza made her own decision. "Get me closer," she told her uncle over the radio. "Esperanza, no, it's too dangerous. Tornado is dying to save his family. The least I can do is let him know I'm safe so he can focus on fighting instead of protecting." Before anyone could stop her, she had released her safety harness and was maneuvering the ATV's controls with practiced skill. The vehicle lurched forward, carrying her toward the edge of the canyon where Tornado could see her. "I'm here," she called out, her voice carrying across the stone amphitheater. "I'm safe. Save your family." The stallion's head turned toward her voice for just a moment, acknowledgement and understanding passing between them. Then he wheeled back toward the poachers with renewed focus, his protective instincts finally freed to concentrate on the immediate threat. What followed was a battle that would be talked about in Montana for generations to come. A wild stallion fighting professional poachers while law enforcement closed in from multiple directions, and a disabled girl sat at the edge of a canyon, proving that courage has nothing to do with the strength of your legs and everything to do with the size of your heart. The sound of gunfire echoed across Thunder Ridge, but this time it was the poachers who were outgunned and outmaneuvered, caught between an enraged stallion and armed rangers who had finally arrived to tip the balance toward justice. The battle for Devil's Canyon lasted 17 minutes, but those minutes stretched like hours as Tornado fought with the fury of a creature protecting everything he held dear. The stallion's exhaustion made him reckless, his charges more desperate than strategic, but his courage inspired the law enforcement officers who were finally closing in on the poacher's position. "Alpha Team, move to high ground," Sheriff Rodriguez commanded over the radio. "Beta Team, cut off their escape route to the south. We need these men alive for prosecution." The poachers had miscalculated badly. They had planned for resistance from the horses and even potential interference from local ranchers. But they hadn't anticipated a coordinated law enforcement response backed by an enraged stallion who fought like he had nothing left to lose. From her position at the canyon's edge, Esperanza watched Tornado drive the armed men back from his cornered herd, his powerful body absorbing wounds that would have killed a lesser animal. Blood streaked his dark coat, but his determination never wavered as he placed himself between the shooters and the 7 mares cowering against the stone wall. "He's been hit," Dr. Thompson reported through binoculars. "Shoulder wound, possibly others. We need to end this before he bleeds out." 30 seconds, Rodriguez replied. "We're almost in position." Those 30 seconds felt like an eternity. As Tornado stumbled, his legs finally betraying the exhaustion and injury that should have dropped him hours earlier. The stallion's fall sent a collective gasp through the watching rescue party, and for a moment it seemed the poachers would succeed in their murderous plan. That was when the mares acted. Led by a grey mare who was clearly the herd's matriarch, the 7 horses erupted from their corner refuge with coordinated fury. They had watched their protector fight alone long enough. Now they fought as a family, their combined charge overwhelming the poachers who suddenly found themselves facing not one desperate stallion, but an entire herd united in defensive rage. "Jesus Christ," one of the poachers screamed as hooves thundered toward his position. "They're all going crazy!" The criminal operation collapsed in minutes, faced with attacking horses from one direction and armed officers from 3 others. The poachers threw down their weapons and surrendered rather than face certain death under the hooves of animals they had tried to slaughter for profit. "All suspects in custody," Rodriguez reported as his deputies secured the crime scene. "Medic! We need veterinary assistance immediately." Dr. Thompson was already rappelling down the canyon wall, her emergency veterinary kit secured to her back. She reached Tornado's side just as the stallion tried to rise, his powerful frame shaking with effort and blood loss. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her hands moving expertly over his wounds. "You did it. Your family is safe." The stallion's dark eyes found Esperanza on the canyon rim above, and in that gaze she saw something that would stay with her for the rest of her life: gratitude, recognition, and the peaceful satisfaction of a guardian whose mission was finally complete. "Will he live?" she called down. "The wounds are serious but treatable. He's lost blood, but his vital organs are intact. This magnificent bastard is too stubborn to die." The rescue helicopters arrived an hour later, their rotors churning dust clouds that obscured the canyon as they evacuated both the injured stallion and the captured poachers. Tornado was sedated for transport, his massive form secured in a specialized stretcher designed for large animals. "Where will they take him?" Esperanza asked as she watched the helicopter carrying her protector disappear over the mountain peaks. "Colorado State University Veterinary Hospital," Warden Martinez replied. "They have the best equine trauma unit in the region. If anyone can save him, they can." The return journey to Eagles Peak High School was subdued, the adrenaline of the morning's battle giving way to exhaustion and reflection. Esperanza rode in contemplative silence, processing the events that had transformed her from victim to protected to active participant in a drama larger than anything she had ever imagined. "You okay?" Bryce asked as they descended the mountain roads. "I think so. Different, but okay." "Different how?" "I spent so much time thinking about what I couldn't do because of this chair. Today, I found out what I could do with it." The insight was simple but profound, a recognition that disability had never been the limiting factor in her life. Fear had been the limitation, fear reinforced by bullies who had taught her to see herself as less capable, less worthy of taking up space in the world. "I'm sorry I was part of teaching you that fear," Bryce said quietly. "You were, but you're not anymore." The forgiveness was genuine, earned through actions rather than words, through sacrifice that had transformed both of them in ways they were only beginning to understand. By evening, News of the day's events had spread across Montana and beyond. Social media carried the story of a disabled girl and her wild horse protector to audiences who shared, commented, and debated the implications of what they had witnessed. Disabled girls' horse guardian fights. Poachers to save wild herd read. The headline in the Denver Post: Montana teen shows real courage has nothing to do with walking, declared the Great Falls Tribune. When Justice Comes on Four Hooves, a story of protection and transformation, was the feature article in National Geographic's online edition. But for Esperanza, the most important recognition came from closer to home. Principal Walsh had called an emergency assembly for the following Monday, where the school board would announce comprehensive policy changes designed to prevent future bullying incidents. The Esperanza Flores Protection Protocols. Representative Santos had named them, legislation that would be introduced in the next session to mandate similar policies statewide. I don't need protocols named after me, Esperanza had protested when she learned about the proposal. It's not about what you need, Santos replied. It's about what other students need. Your courage has created an opportunity to protect kids who haven't found their voice yet. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but also purposeful in a way that gave meaning to everything she had endured. 3 weeks later, Esperanza sat in her wheelchair at the base of Thunder Ridge, watching as a familiar black shape moved slowly down the mountain trail. Tornado's recovery had been remarkable, his wounds healing with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through the battle for his herd. The veterinarians had warned that he might never be quite the same, that the trauma and blood loss could have lasting effects on his strength and endurance. But as Esperanza watched him approach, she saw no diminishment in his nobility or presence. "Hello, friend," she said softly as he drew near. Tornado's approach was gentle, cautious, as if he understood that their relationship had evolved beyond protector and protected into something more complex and mutual. He lowered his massive head until his muzzle brushed her outstretched palm, his breath warm against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The stallion stood with her for several minutes, both of them enjoying the peaceful silence of the mountain afternoon. Then, with a soft whinny that seemed to carry both farewell and blessing, he turned back toward the ridge where his herd was waiting. Esperanza watched him go, knowing that their paths might cross again, but that the desperate urgency that had brought them together was gone. She no longer needed a guardian, and he no longer needed to sacrifice his freedom to ensure her safety. Behind her, a car door slammed as Ruby arrived for their planned afternoon together. "How's our hero doing?" she called out. "He's free," Esperanza replied, still watching Tornado's ascending form. "We both are." The school year that followed would bring its own challenges and victories. Esperanza found her voice in student government, advocating for accessibility improvements and inclusion policies that benefited students throughout the district. Bryce Anderson served his community service hours by volunteering with disabled youth programs, learning that strength could be measured in service rather than dominance. The bullying incidents didn't stop entirely, but they decreased dramatically as students understood that there were now consequences for cruelty, systems in place to protect the vulnerable, and a community willing to stand up for its most marginalized members. Sometimes, on clear mornings, when the light was just right, students at Eagles Peak High School could see a black shape moving along Thunder Ridge, a reminder that protection comes in many forms and that justice, while sometimes delayed, is never denied to those brave enough to demand it. Esperanza Flores had found her strength not despite her wheelchair, but through understanding that courage has nothing to do with the ability to walk and everything to do with the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when you're sitting down. The legend of the girl and her guardian had become something more than a story. It had become a promise that in Willow Creek, Montana, the vulnerable would not face their battles alone, and that sometimes, when human systems fail, nature itself will rise up to protect the innocent. In the end, that was Tornado's greatest gift. Not just protection, but proof that she was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth everything he had given to keep her safe. And in learning to see herself through his eyes, Esperanza had discovered a strength that no bully could ever take away. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.